We are conditioned to believe in a single comforting lie, that history is a straight line. We assume that time always moves forward, and that with time comes progress. We build better, we travel faster, we know more. We assume that once humanity unlocks a technology, like central heating, industrial manufacturing, or mass production, we never lose it. But sometimes the line breaks. Sometimes humanity hits the undo button. In the 5th century, the lights of Europe didn't just flicker, they went out. And this isn't a metaphor. We have physical proof, frozen in the ice caps of the Arctic. When scientists drilled deep into the glaciers of Greenland, they found a layer of lead and copper pollution, the atmospheric exhaust of the massive Roman industrial machine. It had been rising for centuries. And then, right here, it flatlines. It drops to levels not seen since the Stone Age, and stays dead for centuries. To a modern ecologist, that sounds like paradise, but for the people living through it, it meant an apocalypse of silence. It meant that the complex web of trade, technology, and engineering that held daily life together didn't simply pause, it turned off. And when that happened, the collapse wasn't just political, it was biological, it was material, it was visible in the bones and the mud. Archaeologists have found animal remains from this period and discovered something almost humiliating. The cattle shrank. Without the Roman feed systems, breeding networks, and organized agriculture, livestock reverted towards smaller, older sizes, closer to what you see before the imperial machine scaled everything up. Even the animals forgot, and the people forgot too. In the Roman world, workers scribbled motes on wet clay tiles, alphabets, jokes, casual graffiti. Literacy wasn't universal, but it existed enough to leave fingerprints in the everyday. After the crash, that casual writing evaporates. The walls go silent. And then's the most shocking kind of forgetting, technological amnesia. In Britain, the potter's wheel, an old, widely used tool for mass production, doesn't merely become less common, it disappears. For centuries, people go back to shaping rough, crumbly clay by hand. We often say the Roman Empire fell, but that's too soft a word. The truth is more terrifying. The operating system of the Western world crashed, and the people left living among the ruins had to figure out how to survive when the system went offline. To understand the silence that followed, we first have to understand the noise that came before. When we picture Rome, we see the Colosseum, we see gladiators, we see marble statues of angry men in togas. But that wasn't Rome, that was the decoration. The real Rome wasn't a collection of monuments, it was a logistics network. It was the first version of the global internet, built out of stone roads and shipping lanes instead of fiber-optic cables. For the first time in human history, a massive part of the world was standardized. A merchant could travel from the cloudy moors of Britain to the deserts of Syria without ever leaving the system. He used the same money, he followed the same laws, he moved through the same infrastructure. A silver coin minted in one corner of the empire could be accepted in another, because the trust wasn't personal, it was institutional. You didn't need to trust the shopkeeper, you trusted the system. And that system created something dangerous, comfort. And comfort led to something even more dangerous, specialization. Imagine a potter living in Gaul, modern-day France. Before Rome, his ancestors made rough bowls for their village. If the village didn't need bowls, they didn't make them. But under Rome, this potter isn't working for a village, he's working for a factory. He's churning out thousands of identical, high-quality red plates. He doesn't know the people who will eat off them. Some are shipped to Britain, some to the Rhine, some to Italy. He loads them onto a barge and watches the river carry them away like cargo in a bloodstream. He doesn't grow his own food because grain ships bring wheat from North Africa. He doesn't make his own tools because iron comes from mines in Spain. He is a cog in a massive machine, and he is rich because of it. To understand the scale of this, look at modern Rome. There is a hill there called Monte Testaccio. It is 50 meters high, but it's not a natural hill. It is a trash heap composed entirely of 53 million broken olive oil jars imported from Spain. That hill is a monument to a supply chain that vanished. In the Dark Ages, no one could move 53 million of anything across the sea. This was the secret of the Roman operating system. It allowed regions to stop doing everything for themselves and focus on doing one thing well. North Africa grew the wheat, Spain produced the metal, the Balkans provided soldiers, Gaul produced ceramics, Britain supplied wool. It was an ancient version of globalization, efficient, profitable, but it created a fatal dependency. The potter in Gaul depends on the merchant depends on safe roads depend on the army depends on taxes, and taxes depend on the system continuing to run. This is where we have to talk about the power supply. Because like any complex machine, Rome required a massive constant flow of resources to keep it running, and we know exactly where the plug was. It wasn't in Rome. It wasn't in Europe. The engine room of the Western Empire was North Africa. For centuries, convoys of ships sailed from Carthage and the African coastline to Italy, feeding the city of Rome through the grain fleet and funding the imperial budget through taxes and tribute. The Roman world ran on a fiscal spine that linked Africa to Italy and turned harvests into salaries, especially the salaries that kept soldiers standing on the frontiers. Here is the brutal arithmetic behind the myth. Late Rome spent the majority of its revenue on one thing: the professional army. Roman historians and modern historians alike often estimate that roughly 2/3 of the empire's revenues went to maintaining the military machine. That is what it costs to keep 500,000 soldiers deployed across borders, guarding long rivers and mountain passes, holding back threats in places far from the wealth-generating provinces of the Mediterranean. These soldiers didn't farm, they fought. To keep them on that wall, the state had to move enormous wealth from the productive south into the militarized north, and as long as the tax spine held, the circuit worked. The farmer pays the tax, the state moves the tax, the state pays the soldier spends the pay, trade remains safe, taxes remain collectible, the machine continues to run. But cut the spine, and you don't get a smaller empire, you get a paralyzed one. This is why the capture of Carthage in 439 AD matters so much. In 439, the Vandals seize the great African port and take control of the fiscal engine room. They don't need to burn the city to the ground. They don't need to destroy Rome in a cinematic sense. They only have to interrupt the flow. The tap turns off, and the effect on the West is catastrophic. Without African revenue, the Western emperors cannot reliably pay the professional army, and an unpaid professional army doesn't politely shrink, it dissolves. Now the roads become less safe, shipping becomes riskier, trade contracts, tax collection fails further, authority becomes local, and the entire interlocked economy begins to seize up. This brings us to the most frightening lesson of Rome's collapse. Complexity is power, and fragility. A simple system is robust. A village of self-sufficient farmers can survive disruption. If one person dies, the village continues. If a road breaks, they don't care, they don't need it. But a hyper-specialized economy, an interlocked system, cannot easily revert to simplicity. Not quickly, not cleanly. When the central server goes down, specialists don't become generalists overnight. The potter doesn't just make fewer pots. The factory closes. The roof tile industry doesn't just slow, it disappears. Complex systems do not simplify when they fail. They crash. And when they crash, the hardware, the roads, aqueducts, cities, can remain standing for a while, looking deceptively familiar. But the software is gone, and the people living in the ruins are about to learn an ancient truth. You cannot eat stone. So what does it feel like when a system crash hits the ground? It doesn't feel like history. It feels like poverty. Let's go back to the potter in Gaul and give him a life. It is the year 380 AD. He lives in a world of certainty. He works in a workshop that employs dozens of men. The air smells of smoke and wet clay. He sits at a kick wheel, a complex, perfectly balanced machine spinning fast enough to turn skill into mass production. His hands move with muscle memory. In a single day, he produces hundreds of identical bowls, sharp-edged, glossy, waterproof. He loads them onto a barge. Next week they might be on a table in Britain, or in a soldier's mess on the Rhine. He buys oil from Spain and wine from Italy. He sleeps under a roof of fired tile. Now fast forward 3 generations. It is the year 480 AD. The workshop is gone. The kiln is cold. The trade routes are infested with bandits. The merchants are dead, or bankrupt, or simply stopped coming. The potter's grandson still digs clay from the same riverbank, but he is not making hundreds of bowls a day. He is making 2. And the wheel is gone. Not because someone outlawed it, not because it became unfashionable, because the wheel requires a world that can support it. Iron fittings, maintenance, specialized carpentry, supply chains that deliver parts, markets that make the investment worth it. When the economy collapsed, the specialized craftsmen vanished. The knowledge of how to build and maintain the wheel died with them. So the grandson shapes the clay by hand. The bowls are rough, uneven, lamentably friable. They crumble, they leak. They don't resemble the industrial perfection his grandfather produced. If you showed him one of those old red Roman bowls, smooth, standardized, almost modern, he might not think it was made by a human. He might think it was made by something else. This is what the Dark Ages means in material terms. It wasn't simply a change of rulers, it was technological amnesia. People didn't just lose comfort, they lost skills, and the standard of living dropped fast enough and deep enough that it took centuries to claw back. Look up at the roofs. In the Roman world, even people far from the capital could live under tiled roofs, durable, waterproof, standardized. But tile is not a simple craft. It requires quarries, transport, fuel, coordinated labor, and safe movement. When the system went offline, tiles stopped coming. So when a roof broke, you couldn't buy a replacement. You patched it with wood, then with straw, then with mud. Slowly, over decades, the color of the built world changed. The red, orderly towns became grey, improvised settlements. Stone cities began to decompose, not because stone rots, but because the functions that keep stone cities alive vanished. Now imagine a place like Roxeter in Britain around the year 500. Your grandfather told you stories about the great baths, heated pools, steam rooms, mosaics, engineered comfort. But you don't see a spa, you see a quarry. When supply chains collapse, people start mining their own cities. They need stone, they dismantle temples and bath complexes. They need iron, they rip clamps from walls. They need building material, they strip the rillings, because there is no longer a market that delivers new stone. And the most chilling part is this: the baths weren't destroyed by barbarians in a dramatic raid. They were dismantled by locals, because the roof collapsed, because the system that maintained it was gone, and because stone is stone, whether it comes from a sacred building or a pig pen. This is the moment of disconnection. The horizon of the world shrinks. Under Rome, a man's world could be 3,000 miles wide. He might eat grain from one region, use oil from another, spend coins minted in the third. Now his world ends at the forest line. If you can't walk there safely, it doesn't exist. There is no mail, no news, no reliable authority, no guarantee that anyone will fix the road, patrol the route, or punish the bandit. And for the first time in centuries, millions of Western Europe are truly alone. The safety net is gone. And in that silence, they realize something terrifying. The barbarians are no longer the main problem. The problem is, there is no one left to make the system work, no one left to fix the roads, no one left to keep the machine running. But poverty is manageable, starvation is not. The system didn't just make bowls, it moved food. Rome was a city that had been fed like an artificial paradise, its population sustained by shipments and distributions that only a functioning state could coordinate. When the operating system began to freeze, the ships stopped coming. And there is a moment recorded in history that captures a moment when Roman civilization snapped, not as an idea, but as a biological reality. It happened during the siege of 408 AD. The Visigoth king Alaric surrounded the city. He controlled the roads, he controlled the river approaches. Nothing went in, nothing came out. Inside the walls, Rome starved. Rations were cut, then cut again. And yet the momentum of the old world was so strong that rituals continued. People were hungry, but they were still Romans. And Romans go to the arena. So the games were held. Crowds gathered in the Colosseum, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because habit is the last thing that survives when the future disappears. They watched the hunts, they watched the killing, but the meaning of the spectacle had changed. In the old days, the crowd cheered for blood and skill. Now a contemporary account describes something darker. When an animal was killed, when the carcass lay steaming on the sand, the crowd didn't cry for victory, they cried for meat. They began shouting, "Let us buy that meat! How much per pound?" Imagine that scene. The greatest theatre in the world, marble seats, the emperor's box, the architecture of dominion. And in those seats, thousands of skeletal citizens not watching a sport, but bargaining over a corpse like people at a market during famine. The ritual of empire is still being performed, but the spell is broken. The citizens of Rome are no longer masters of the world. They are starving animals in a cage. 2 years later, in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The walls were breached. It was the first time Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. Far away in Bethlehem, St. Jerome wrote in horror, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." For the people living then, the end of the world didn't wait for 476. It happened right here. When the siege ended, the city survived, but the system did not. Over time, the population of Rome likely collapsed, down from something like a metropolis to something closer to a scattered remnant. And that brings us to the final witness of disconnection, the buildings themselves. We look at the Colosseum today and see a romantic ruin, a monument. But to people living after the crash, it wasn't history, it was material, it was shelter, it was salvage. Because when central authority evaporates, there is no one to repair aqueducts, no one to maintain streets, no one to protect monuments. The great Colosseum fell silent, but it didn't stay empty. At various intervals it became something unthinkable for the symbol of Roman dominance, a landfill, a shelter for the destitute, a haven for packs of animals. In corridors where gladiators once waited for death, people built makeshift huts. They blocked arches with mud brick to keep out the wind. Goats grazed where crowds once screamed. Wild dogs moved through tunnels. And then the Colosseum became a mine. People realized the iron clamps holding the stone blocks together had value. They hacked into the masonry to steal the metal. They stripped marble from the facade to burn it into lime for mortar. They weren't vandals performing ideology, they were survivors performing arithmetic. They lived in the skeleton of a dead giant. They saw baths, aqueducts, amphitheatres, and they could no longer understand how they had been built, because their world no longer contained the software that made such things possible. To many, these ruins were not the work of men. They were the work of giants, of demons, of magic. Because in their world, if you wanted a stone for a wall, you didn't hire an architect, you went to a Roman ruin and stole a stone. The system was offline, and humanity was starting over among the rubble. So the economy is breaking. The roads are thinning, factories are closing. The old system, the one that made the world feel predictable, is failing. But people remain, and wherever people remain, a question returns like gravity. Who is in charge? Under Rome, the answer was simple: the emperor. His face was on the money, his statues were in the square, his laws travelled farther than any man could ride. When we think of the year 476, the year textbooks label the fall of Rome, we expect a fire, we expect a scream, we expect a barbarian king standing over a dead emperor with a bloody sword. But that didn't happen. What happened was administration. In 476, this wasn't an alien invasion, it was a mutiny. Odoacer wasn't just a Germanic warlord, he was a general of the Roman army. He and his men had been educated in the legions. They didn't want to destroy Rome, they wanted to be paid by it. When the payment didn't come, Odoacer marched into Ravenna not to burn it, but to file a grievance. He deposed the teenage emperor, Romulus Augustulus. But he didn't butcher him, he didn't stage a ritual execution. He gave him a pension. He sent him to live quietly in comfort near Naples. And then Odoacer did something that reveals the psychology of the age. He gathered the imperial regalia, the crown, the scepter, the purple robes, the symbols of a world order that had defined the West for centuries. He didn't put them on his own head. He packed them into a box, and he shipped them east to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. He sent a letter that essentially said, "The West no longer needs an emperor of its own. One is enough. I will rule here as your representative." And the irony is, for a moment, it worked. The civil wars eased, the constant chaos of competing emperors and usurpers faded. To a Roman senator in 480 AD, life under a barbarian king could feel more predictable than life under the last decades of collapsing imperial politics. This matters because it destroys the stereotype. The barbarians didn't arrive with a plan to burn civilization, they arrived with a plan to enter it. They were like squatters moving into a billionaire's abandoned mansion. They didn't want to burn the house down, they wanted to live in it. They wanted the suits in the closet, the wine in the cellar, the prestige of the address. They wanted to drive the magnificent machine. But they had a problem. They had force, not authority. Force is when people obey you because you will kill them if they don't. Authority is when people obey you because they believe you have the right to rule. And legitimacy, the idea of rightful rule, was still Roman. So the new kings spent generations performing legitimacy. They didn't dare call themselves imperator. That title was too sacred, too dangerous, too charged. They called themselves rex. They called themselves patrician. They sent letters to Constantinople pretending to be loyal stewards, caretakers, representatives. Everyone knew the fiction, but everyone needed it, because without legitimacy, the entire social structure might collapse into open revolt. This is why the post-Roman West isn't best imagined as an age of monsters. It is better imagined as an age of costume, a cosplay empire. Look at Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy after 493. He was a Gothic warlord, but on his coins he appears in Roman armour. He holds the globe, the symbol of world power. The inscriptions borrow Roman language of authority. But look closer at his face. He wears a moustache. No Roman emperor would ever display a moustache like that. In Roman visual culture, it signals the outsider, the barbarian identity that refuses to fully disappear. It is a perfect symbol of the era. Roman clothing, barbarian hair, a fusion of incompatible worlds, stitched together because the world had to keep functioning somehow. And for a while it could look convincing. The Senate still met in Rome for a time. Latin remained the language of administration. In parts of Italy and southern Gaul, a wealthy Roman could still live among the shells of old institutions and pretend the world hadn't ended. But it was a performance, a cargo cult. Because the one thing that made Rome Rome, the centralized state, was dead. The new rulers had inherited the controls without the blueprints. Remember what the Roman system required: a tax machine that could extract revenue from millions of people, transform it into cash and supplies, and pay a professional standing army. The new kings could not replicate that. They didn't have the bureaucracy, they didn't have the records, and often they didn't have the legitimacy to demand taxes at the same scale without rebellion. So how do you keep warriors loyal if you can't reliably pay them? You pay them with the only asset left: land. This is the pivot point where the Roman state dies in practice and something else begins. Under Rome, a general depended on salaries from the centre. If the emperor cut him off, he weakened. The lever of power was financial. Under the new kings, a warrior receives an estate. He grows his own food. He collects his own rents. He builds his own local power base. Once you give a warrior land, he doesn't need you in the same way. The king in the capital might wear a toga, he might sign documents in Latin, he might call himself consul, but he has lost the lever that turns the machine on or off. Power becomes local. Under Rome, power was a network. An order given in Italy could be obeyed in distant provinces. Now power becomes a radius. How far can your horse ride in one day? That is your kingdom. If you cannot reach a village to enforce your will, you do not truly control it. So the state stops being abstract, it becomes personal. You don't pay taxes to a distant system. You offer food and labor to the local strongman because you want to survive. We have a name for the mature version of this system. We call it feudalism. But in the moment, it doesn't feel like a political theory. It feels like protection. It feels like a world where the difference between government and a gang becomes difficult to measure, and that created a terrifying diplomatic reality. Europe was no longer a map of provinces, it became a map of competing coalitions: Franks in Gaul, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in Africa, Lombards waiting on the horizon. They spoke rough Latin, they wore Roman symbols, they maintained Roman titles. But the current wasn't flowing. It was power without a socket. And as the years passed, even the pretense began to fade. The Roman Senate, an institution that had existed for 1,000 years, didn't get formally abolished. People simply stopped showing up. The games became too expensive, the aqueducts became harder to maintain, the administrative class thinned. And in a vacuum where the state had failed, and kings looked increasingly like armed landlords, people began to search for a different kind of authority, one that didn't require taxes, one that didn't require legions, one that claimed to be eternal. If the empire of man had failed, maybe it was time to try the empire of God. If the Roman state was the operating system, and it crashed in the 5th century, why are we here today? Why didn't Europe simply revert to the Iron Age and stay there? The answer is that before the system went totally offline, it managed to create a backup. Not a perfect backup. Rome's comfort, its mass production, its urban abundance would vanish, but a backup of something more fundamental: administration, literacy, a continental language. And the most important node of that backup was sitting in every city when the governors fled and the army dissolved: the bishop. In the chaos of collapse, the church ceased to be just a religious organization. It became a survival mechanism. When tax collectors fled, when judges didn't show up, when aqueducts broke and food distribution failed, someone still had to make the city function. Who repairs the walls? Who negotiates with the army at the gates? Who organizes relief in famine? In many places, it wasn't a king, it was the bishop. We can see this in explicit cases. In Gaul, in the city of Cahors in the 7th century, a bishop named Desiderius appears in the record not as a distant mystic, but as a practical administrator. He repairs infrastructure, he rebuilds, he organizes civic life. He behaves like a city manager in a world that has lost its civil government. Or look at the frontier region of Noricum in modern Austria. When the Roman army's pay stopped arriving, the frontier order collapsed. In that vacuum, a holy man named Severinus became the organizing center. He negotiated with barbarian leaders, he coordinated defense, he managed refugees and supplies. People followed him not because he wore armor, but because he was one of the last functioning administrative nodes. This is the practical secret of the church's survival. It copied the Roman structure so well that when the secular state failed, the ecclesiastical structure could inherit its role. The church had hierarchy, records, trained administrators. It could coordinate across distance through letters and councils. While political borders fragmented, the map of the church retained a kind of continuity. It became a ghost empire. A diocese in Gaul could still be connected to a diocese in Italy. Bishops could still write to each other. The church preserved an information network that outlived governors and kings. And the network did something even more important than fixing walls. It preserved code, Latin. Outside the church, spoken Latin began to fracture into early dialects that would one day become French, Spanish, Italian. But inside the church, the language froze. It remained standardized. This matters more than it sounds, because you cannot run complex administration through a local dialect that changes every 50 miles. You need a universal code. And the new Germanic kings, Franks, Visigoths, Lombards, needed administration. They needed laws, they needed treaties, they needed property deeds. But many of them did not have a written tradition in their own languages, and many lacked an educated bureaucratic class. So, when they wanted to create a kingdom, they needed clerics. They needed the Roman software. That is why so many barbarian law codes and legal documents appear in Latin. The church became the interface between warlords and statehood. Without clerics, the newcomers could have remained tribal chiefs. With clerics, they could become kings. And then there was the deep storage. If bishops were the last officials standing in cities, monasteries became servers in the forest. We tend to imagine monks as people fleeing the world, but in the Dark Ages, they were preserving it. A Roman aristocrat named Cassiodorus saw the crash coming. He served the Ostrogothic kings in Italy, but he understood that the secular world was dissolving, so he withdrew to his estate and founded a monastery called Vivarium with an explicit mission: move the library into the Ark before the flood reaches it. He instructed monks to copy everything. Yes, scripture, but also grammar, history, logic, medicine, astronomy, law. Across Europe, monasteries became time capsules, self-sufficient nodes of order. They had farms, workshops, mills, and crucially, scriptoriums. Imagine a cold room in northern Europe around 700. A monk sits at a desk, hands numb, copying a text letter by letter. He may not fully understand what he is copying. He has never seen the Rome described in the pages, but he copies anyway. Because in a world where books rot and papyrus shipments no longer arrive, writing becomes an act of survival. He is a human Xerox machine. and because of him, and thousands like him, the memory of Rome does not vanish completely. Not the comfort of Rome, that is gone, but the idea that life can be ordered, written, governed by law. Europe does not disappear, it is reformatted. The empire falls, but the Roman-shaped institution survives, expands, and fills the silence. The operating system is saved, but the user interface changes completely, because the men running the backup system do not worship Rome. They believe that earthly empires fail, and that only one empire is eternal. In the minds of the people, the emperor is no longer a man in Ravenna or Constantinople. The new emperor is Christ. So the empire is gone. The church is running the backup. The old Roman grid, the straight lines drawn by surveyors, the neat administrative provinces, has dissolved into a blur. If you look at a map of Europe around the year 500, it looks like an unfinished puzzle of the modern world. You see names you recognize: Franks, Angles, Burgundians. You can feel the temptation to say, this is where the French and the English were born. But that map is a lie. It's tempting to read these labels, Franks, Angles, Goths, as if they were modern nations waiting to be born. But many of these identities were fluid. They weren't ancient tribes with fixed borders, marching like countries. They were confederations, war bands, coalitions that formed and reformed under pressure. In many cases, a people became a people after entering the Roman world, after settling, after fighting, after merging with locals, after generations of shared violence and shared survival. That's why a map of the year 500 can mislead you. It looks like modern Europe with rough edges, but it's closer to a storm chart, clusters of armed communities hardening into something that will, centuries later, resemble states. So the most important question isn't only who they were, it's why they survived. Why did these unwashed, often illiterate warriors succeed in inheriting the West, while the sophisticated Roman machine collapsed? The answer isn't just swords, it's also mud and manure. For centuries, Roman writers, and later Romantic historians, described the barbarians as starving savages banging at the gates of civilization, but archaeology tells a more complicated story. In many regions beyond the imperial frontier, parts of Germany, Poland, and the north, evidence suggests growth. Pollen analysis shows expanding cultivation, fields push outward, production intensifies. We see signs of innovation suited to heavy soils that Romans often avoided. We see manure being used more intensively, and we see the ecological footprint of a population that is not shrinking but expanding. This is the barbarian engine, biology and agriculture. Rome had the engineers, but the barbarians had demographic weight, and they had fear. Behind them, pushing from the east, was a new force the Roman world barely understood: the Huns. Hever called it a billiard ball effect. One hit from the east, and suddenly entire people start rolling forward. Peoples collide, scatter, regroup, move again, pushing one another like balls across a table, until the Roman frontier becomes the last wall left. So some of the tribes crossing into the empire were not only invaders, they were also refugees, moving because something worse was moving behind them. And that human reality matters, because it fits the larger theme of this series. These were not monsters, they were people navigating a collapsing world. Now, this vitality, this pressure, this demographic engine collided with the Roman ruins in different ways, depending on the region. And from those collisions, 3 experiments emerged. 3 answers to the question, how do you build a state without Rome? In Gaul, modern France, the crash produced a merger. A Germanic group called the Franks didn't simply conquer the Romans, they married them. Their leader was a brutal, intelligent warlord named Clovis. Clovis understood a cold truth. You can conquer a province with an axe, but you cannot rule it with an axe. Gaul was full of Roman people, millions of them. They spoke Latin, they respected bishops, they were still culturally Roman even if the imperial government had collapsed. If Clovis remained a pagan outsider, he would always be fighting the population he needed to tax and recruit. So he made a strategic choice. He converted to Catholic Christianity. It looked like a spiritual moment, a king kneeling, accepting baptism, but it was also a political masterstroke. Because when Clovis converted, the most powerful administrative network in the West, the Church, could align with him. Bishops could tell Roman populations, he is legitimate, obey him. This created a hybrid superpower, Frankish military muscle fused with Roman administrative brain. Roman landowners kept estate, Frankish warriors gained authority and revenue. Over time, the elites merge, names mix, customs blend. Within a few generations, the boundaries become hard to see. And the ultimate proof of the merger's success is linguistic and symbolic. The name of the tribe becomes the name of the country, Franks, France. In Gaul, Rome didn't simply die, it mutated. It evolved into something else. Across the Channel in Britain, the crash looked different. Here, the operating system wasn't patched, it was deleted. When Roman legions withdrew and Roman authority collapsed, the lights didn't merely dim, they were smashed. And when new groups arrived, the Angles and Saxons, many were not interested in Roman cosplay. They didn't want to sit in villas and preserve baths. They looked at stone ruins with underfloor heating and saw haunted shells. Many refused to inhabit them, building wooden halls nearby while Roman structures rotted back into earth. Archaeology reflects this simplification with a kind of brutality. In 400 AD, Britain is a world of mass-produced pottery and coinage. By 500 AD, pottery is handmade and crude, and money has nearly vanished from daily circulation in many regions. This is not gradual evolution, it is a hard reset. And the most dramatic evidence of the reset is language. In Gaul, spoken Latin decays into early French. In Britain, Latin does not decay, it is annihilated. The Germanic dialects of the newcomers become the foundation of Old English. Within generations, people no longer remember themselves as Roman. The ruins become the work of giants, magic, demons, anything but ordinary human engineering, because the new world no longer has the institutional memory to recognize what it is seeing. Britain starts over from zero. Yet, strictly speaking, this wasn't a tragedy for everyone. To the Romanized elite, it was the end of the world, but for the peasant in the field, maybe it was a relief. The heating system stopped working, yes, but the tax collector stopped coming too. The state collapsed, and the economy shrank to the village level, but for many, perhaps the freedom was worth the mud. And then there is Italy. If you were betting on the future in the year 500, you might not bet on muddy Gaul or shattered Britain. You would bet on Italy. Because Italy, contrary to the cliché, did not collapse first. In some ways, it held on the longest. Under Theoderic, Italy could look like a paradise of preservation. Aqueducts were maintained, marshes drained, Roman institutions continued. In the early 6th century, a citizen could still walk through Rome, see the Senate, hear educated Latin, live within a cultural world that still felt Roman. Italy is the tragedy of this story precisely because it didn't fall cleanly. It survived, and then it was destroyed by being saved. In the mid-5th century, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian decided to reconquer Italy. He wanted to restore the old map, to pull the West back into the Roman system. The wars that followed, the Gothic Wars, became a grinder. Armies marched up and down the peninsula for years, liberating the land by exhausting it. And this is where the ancient world in Italy truly dies in material terms. Sieges cut the aqueducts that had kept the city alive for centuries. Without water, the great baths stopped working forever, and the sewage systems dried up. It was this war of liberation, not the barbarian invasions, that truly destroyed the infrastructure. The population of Rome crashed from hundreds of thousands to a scattered few living in shacks next to the skeletons of dead monuments. The delicate remnants of Roman urban life, already fragile, shatter under prolonged warfare. A city can survive invasion, but it struggles to survive decades of rescue. Italy fractures, Rome shrinks further, the peninsula becomes a battlefield prize fought over by successive powers. The idea of a unified Italy becomes a distant dream, not a living reality. So those are the three experiments: Gaul, fusion; Britain, hard reset; Italy, tragedy. And together they reveal a larger shift. For 1,000 years, the world meant the Mediterranean: Rome, Carthage, Athens, Alexandria. The north was a forest, a borderland. After the crash, the Mediterranean becomes dangerous: piracy, instability, war, plague. The southern core that had powered Roman unity becomes a contested zone. So gravity moves. Civilization migrates north and inland toward the Rhineland and the heavy soils of northern Europe. The axis shifts from olive groves and marble to forests and iron. The classical world of toga and bath culture fades. The European world, cold, rural, militarized, begins. These embryonic states are poor and fragile. They are experiments in survival. None of them are guaranteed to last. And looming over them to the east is the surviving Roman machine, still running, still wealthy, still dangerous. A ghost that refuses to die. So was this collapse inevitable? Was Rome just old? Did it die of natural causes, as some historians once liked to imagine? Christianity, decadence, poisoned elites, moral rot, an empire that simply deserved to fall. We don't need to guess. We have a control group. Look east. While the lights were going out in Britain, Gaul and Italy, the system was still running in Constantinople. Taxes were still being collected, gold coinage remained pure, the professional army was paid, the bureaucracy functioned. The Eastern Roman Empire experienced prosperity in the 5th and 6th centuries, while the West struggled to survive. And in the year 500, while the West is building with wood and thatch, the East is building miracles. While Italy bleeds, the Emperor Justinian builds. Constantinople is constructing the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so mathematically complex, with a dome that seemed to hang in the air, that the West wouldn't be able to replicate its engineering for another 1,000 years. It proved that Roman technology hadn't died, it had just moved to a safer address. The survival of the East proves something crucial. Roman civilization did not die of old age. The East had Christianity. The East had court intrigue. The East had the same late imperial culture. And it survived for another 1,000 years. So the West did not die of natural causes. It died of injuries. But who killed it? This is where the story becomes colder. The tragedy of Rome's fall is that there were no murderers, only accomplices. The Germanic kings, Alaric, Theodoric, Clovis, did not hate Rome. They admired it. They didn't want to destroy the empire. They wanted to join it. They wanted the villas, the silk, the wine, the titles. They wanted to drive the magnificent machine. But to get into the driver's seat, they had to break the doors. And once inside, They discovered they didn't know how to refuel the engine. They demanded land for their warriors instead of salaries. They thought it was a small adjustment, simply a practical solution in a cash-poor world. They didn't realize that by taking land, they were dismantling the tax system. They broke the fiscal spine, and when the fiscal spine broke, the professional army dissolved. When the army dissolved, safety disappeared. When safety disappeared, trade contracted. When trade contracted, money thinned. When money thinned, specialization died. When specialization died, skills vanished. The barbarians didn't murder Roman civilization. They were guilty of something worse. They were guilty of manslaughter. They hugged the empire so tight that they suffocated it. And so we return to where we started, the silence. The people of the 6th century lived in a landscape of skeletons. They walked beneath aqueducts they could no longer repair. They travelled roads they could no longer build. They inhabited cities whose functions they could no longer understand. They were not primitives. They were survivors of a shipwreck, living along the shore, using the debris of a great liner to build shelter from the rain. Did they know it was the end? Probably not. Human beings adapt. When the pottery factory closes, you use a wooden bowl. When roof tiles break, you use straw. When the school closes, you teach your child a spear instead of a pen. You adjust, and in that adjustment, the civilization fades. Not with a bang, with a whisper. But history rarely stays quiet for long. As the West stabilizes into fragile new kingdoms, 2 storms gather beyond the horizon. But it wasn't just war. It was bad luck on a cosmic scale. Just as the East tried to rescue the West, nature itself turned against the restoration of Rome. In 536 AD, a major dust veil event obscured the sun for over a year, causing harvests to fail across the Mediterranean. And then the ships brought something worse than soldiers, the plague. Starting in 541, the bubonic plague swept through the empire. It didn't care about politics. It killed an enormous share of urban populations, estimates vary. The operating system didn't just crash, the hardware was melted by fever. The manpower needed to rebuild civilization was simply buried in mass graves. In the East, a new Roman emperor is waking up. His name is Justinian. He looks at Italy and does not see a tragedy. He sees a target. He is preparing a war of liberation. He doesn't know yet that this rescue mission will grind Italy down, breaking aqueducts, emptying cities, finishing what the 5th century started, a salvation that will prove more destructive than many of the invasions that came before it. And far to the south, in the deserts of Arabia, beyond the vision of any Roman or Persian spy, a new idea is waiting to be born. An idea that will sweep away the old world and redraw the map faster than Rome ever did. The system is offline, the backup is running, but the night has only just begun.